My name is Rose Walters, and for my paper 3 on power, sovereignty, and international relations, I'll be analyzing the following question: to what extent is Somalia considered a fragile state? I will be discussing the following: what fragile states are, how they are measured, to what extent Somalia is considered fragile, which international multilateral efforts have been put into place to help Somalia, as well as the effects fragile states have on the global community. According to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, a fragile state is defined as a state that is unable to perform basic functions in the areas of security, rule of law, and basic social services such as humanitarian aid and education. Common shared characteristics among fragile states include that many are heavy on economic and political interdependence. They also often rely on single export commodities when trading. There's often internal and external displacement of people. There's often a corrupt government or lack of control over the people, as well as they have a hard time to develop, and this could be due to the lack of meeting the needs of the physiological and safety needs when looking at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. One way to measure the fragility of states is through the Fund for Peace Fragile State Index. This index consists out of 12 indicators, which fall under the categories either of cohesion, economic, political, or social and cross-cutting. And a state is considered fragile when it has an index score of 60 or above out of 120, and obviously the higher the score, the more fragile the state is to be considered. According to this is a very useful method as it allows organizations and states to see early stages of fragility and also increase and be more effective in policy responses. According to the Fragile State Index, Somalia is ranked second out of 178 countries with a score of 113.4 out of 120. For the last 10 years, Somalia has been in the top 3 most fragile states. Just by looking at these values, Somalia could be considered to a large extent fragile. But what caused Somalia to become this fragile and receive such a high fragile state index score? Well, one factor that contributed to this was the overthrow of the military regime of President Said Barre in 1991. It was overthrown as militias battled for control over the capital, Mogadishu. Somalia collapsed into anarchy, leaving them with little power over the state, people, and which obviously affected their sovereignty. There have been several attempts to restore control over the state, including in 2000 when an internationally backed government, the Transitional Federal Government, was formed. There were mixed feelings about this being set into place, as there were positive views as they were trying to help establish control over the state, yet after a year they realized that it was very ineffective and that militias still had most of the control and grew stronger, causing them to be unable to establish control over the state. But in 2012, however, there was finally some structure introduced when the first formal parliament was formed, as well as the first indirect presidential elections were held since 1967. Despite taking steps in the right direction, there have been some questions about the legal legitimacy of these electoral processes, as there were speculations that bribery and corruption occurred during this. Due to this, the Factionalized Elites Indicator from the Fragile State Index, which looks at power struggles, political competition transitions, and the credibility of electoral processes drastically increased, causing it to have a score 10 out of 10. The second factor that put a lot of pressure on Somalia derives from the population itself and the environment around it, and this Fragile State Indicator is the demographic pressures indicator. And this increased as in 2011 and 2012 there was the Horn of Africa crisis, and what this was is that for 4 consecutive years there were poor rainfall, causing massive livestock losses, which put a lot of strain on the Somali economy. This is because, according to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, 65% of the earnings 65% of the exports are earned through the agricultural sector. This also caused a big influence as 250,000 people were left in famine and 6.7 million people were in desperate need for humanitarian assistance, according to the UN. And also UNICEF claimed that 350,000 children under the age of 5 had severe malnutrition. The last indicator that was significant is the security apparatus, which looks at security threats such as bombing, terrorism, and attacks. And this has recently took a big hit on the indicator, as the Al-Qaeda-aligned Al-Shabaab has reportedly killed over 4,200 people in 2016 alone, overtaking Boko Haram as the deadliest Islam terror group in Africa, according to the Counter-Extremist Project. And also on the 14th of October 2017, Al-Shabaab was credited for the worst terror attack in Somalia when 2 trucks exploded in the capital Mogadishu, leaving over 500 people killed and 300 people injured, according to the Zob Rescue Committee. Also, the UN Security Committee has spoken out about this, saying that Al-Shabaab is the biggest threat to peace in Somalia. But not only do terrorist groups threat peace, they also threat national sovereignty. This is because terrorism often spreads across different countries, and this was seen in 9/11 when Al-Qaeda attacked the US. And I think at this point it made the world realize that fighting terrorism is an international issue and that we should confront it together. Also, Also, because terrorists are really hard to fight, this often requires non-state actors to get involved as well, and this could be interpreted for some countries. It could affect their sovereignty as you are letting in people outside of the country, and this could be interpreted as invading the country, which possibly affects their national security. But what have non-state actors and states done to help Somalia? Well, there have been a lot of international efforts put towards Somalia, and one of them is the USA. The USA has tried to increase security in Somalia by working closely with their military, as well as stationing 500 and above troops in order to combat radical Islamists such as Al-Shabaab and ISIS. Secondly, the NGO UNICEF has provided services or delivered services to 15,000 young children who have suffered from malnutrition in the south and center of Somalia. And they were able to provide this as China has donated $2 million towards this. And thirdly, the IGO African Union mission in Somalia has also tried to establish the Peace and Security Council of the African Union with full support of the United Nations, and this is done to help stabilize the state. Other examples include the International Security Committee, Amnesty, the United Nations, Save the Children, the EU, and many more. But why is it important for fragile states to help? Why is it important for stabler states to help fragile states? Well, because fragile states are anomalies in the international system, for humanitarian reasons, it's important to sustain development and to improve global security, as fragile states do threaten the global and regional security. Also, fragile states have a big impact because there is so much displacement. It causes other states to get lots of refugee flows, and this often cross borders and can appeal to neighboring groups for involvement. But how involved should they get? So there are two perspectives, the liberalism and the realists, and realists believe that by letting non-state actors, it just ruins and reduces Somalia's power and sovereignty, while liberalists believe that by working together with non-state actors, it is very important, and that they believe that in Somalia they haven't interfered enough. But there have been lots of resources provided, it does put a lot of pressure towards Somalia as it is overwhelming. But to conclude, with all of this information, To what extent is Somalia considered fragile? From this evidence, I would say that it is to a large extent fragile.